Good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome you this evening in fellowship. I love hearing the conversation and the laughter in the room. It's been missed, hasn't it? But welcome to this evening of fellowship as we reflect on an important and sometimes really difficult topic through the lens of storytelling. I'm Lisa Sprinkle. I'm the president of the Roanoke Valley Palliative Care Partnership and vice president of Carilion Clinic Home Care and Hospice. And on behalf of our board and members, I extend a warm welcome to each of you. Our Palliative Care Partnership was actually established in 2001, and we were comprised of a group of people who were collectively focused on empowering others to make decisions about quality palliative and end-of-life care. And though our group has matured in number and knowledge, we remain steadfastly committed to developing a culture in our community that confronts fear and creates a forum for conversation and promotes the goals and wishes of those with whom we care. The truth of the matter is we live in a very highly medicalized society. And if we admit it ourselves, we look to our healthcare providers to conquer disease and do everything they can to facilitate healing. But this is an important point that sometimes we fail to acknowledge, and that is that the very medical treatments that were designed to benefit us can sometimes become ineffective. And in some cases, they could produce more harm than good. We as healthcare providers see with regularity the outcomes that happen when planning doesn't occur. And those outcomes are vastly different in comparison to those that occur when appropriate planning is done. So the spirit with which we come together this evening is to have a conversation. And that might involve some introspection. And why is this so important? 92% of people that are surveyed say that talking with a loved one about end-of-life care is important, but in reality, only a third of those individuals have had such a conversation. 60% of people say that making sure that family is not burdened with making those decisions on our behalf is extremely important. And yet 56% have not communicated their wishes. 80% of people say that if they had a serious or complex illness, they would want their doctor to know about the medical treatments they may or may not want to have. And yet only 7% of people have had that conversation with their provider. Lastly, 82% of people say that it's important to put their wishes in writing, and really less than 0.25% have done so. We as a society tend to avoid these conversations. We don't want to talk about death and dying. So tonight, let's change the construct of the conversation, because the first step in the process of advanced care planning is really one of reflection and thoughtfulness. Advanced care planning is a reflection of what life means to each of us. It may mean something entirely different to me or to you, and that's okay. I want to be remembered by how I lived, not by how I died. So let's approach the conversation in the spirit of living well. The answers to the questions form the very basis of our advanced care plan. That's step one in the process. Step two is sharing our thoughts and feelings, our desires and wishes with at least two important people. I would contend it's better to share it with all those who you hold dear. But if you cannot do that, two people are vastly important. our provider, our physician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, and the individual whom we task with making sure that our wishes and values are honored at a time in our life when we might not be able to do that ourselves. So now that we've had the introspection and we've had the conversation, the third step is putting it in writing. Documenting our wishes on an advance directive provides a document that anyone caring for us can refer to. That document might reflect our wishes and values, but at the very least, it identifies the individual whom we have entrusted to assert our wishes, our goals, and our values at the point at which we can't speak for ourselves. An advance directive is an easily accessible document. It's downloadable. We have copies here at the front this evening, and it doesn't necessarily require legal representation to complete. So this evening, we're fortunate to have several advanced care planning facilitators with us. They're in the front of the room. They not only have significant knowledge, but they have printed resources and materials for you to take with you. Please take an opportunity to visit their tables. They can answer questions, address any concerns that you might have, and they can provide you a list of those resources I just referred to. In addition, that resource document will be distributed as you leave this evening. And we're pleased to have a videographer with us this evening, and he will capture our time together. And the video link will be placed on our PCPRV website following the event at pcprv.org. So let's quickly review the evening's events. We begin with our keynote speaker, whom I will formally introduce in a moment. Following Mr. Davis's time with us, we have a panel of experts who will reflect on the discussion and provide some additional context as it relates to advanced care planning. That panel is going to be moderated by Seth McCormick. Seth is a chaplain at Carilion Roanoke Memorial Hospital, and he is a member of our Palliative Partnership. Our panelists also include Dr. Christy Stewart, Medical Director for Palliative Medicine at Carilion Roanoke Memorial Hospital, and she's the Medical Director of Carilion Clinic Hospice of Roanoke. Dr. Stewart is also an Associate Program Director for Hospice and Palliative Medicine Fellowship and is an Assistant Professor of Medicine at Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine. And she's also a mother of 2 teenage sons. Also joining Dr. Stewart on our panel is Caroline Butt. Caroline is a nurse, and she is a member of the Virginia Post Executive Committee. And Carolyn is nationally known as a member of the National Post Plenary Assembly. And Caroline will explain to you a post and a pulse form during the panel interview. We also have with us on our panel Shauna Caldwell. Shauna is a medical social worker and certified dementia practitioner with Good Samaritan Hospice. And lastly, our storyteller, Mr. Donald Davis, will round out our panel. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our keynote presenter, Donald Davis. Mr. Davis was born in Waynesville, North Carolina, a small town rich in stories. While he heard many traditional stories about Jack and other heroic characters, he was most attracted to the stories of his own family and places of origin. Donald began retelling the stories he heard, and then he added his own twist until he was repeatedly asked, "Tell it again on purpose." During his career as a United Methodist minister, Donald began to integrate stories more and more into his sermons, and he was asked to perform at festivals and other settings until after 25 years in the ministry, he retired to become a full-time professional storyteller. The author of 18 books and more than 40 original recordings, Donald is the recipient of both the Circle of Excellence and the Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Storytelling Network. His long career as a storyteller and his promotion of the cultural importance of storytelling led him to be dubbed the Dean of Storytelling. So tonight, the Palliative Partnership of the Roanoke Valley is honored to have him present Stories from the Heart, opening the door to end-of-life conversations. Please join me in welcoming Donald Davis.
Thank you. I want to put the clock down there so we'll get out of church in time. I'm told I'm to tell stories for an hour, which will put us a little bit past the 8 o'clock time, but I'll try to tighten that up as much as I can. I have a friend over in Charlotte, Chuck Edwards. Chuck was a heart surgeon, and some years ago in the middle of surgery, he saw one of his hands shaking. And he said in that moment he thought, my life is over. But later on, and he actually credits a TED Talk I did to some of this process, he realized, no, my life is not over. My life as a heart surgeon is over. I'm still a doctor. And he actually went back to Johns Hopkins and did an internship in geriatric medicine and opened a brand new practice in Charlotte dealing with proprioception and memory loss issues. A little book came out of that called Much Abides. And the whole thesis of that book is the secret to aging, all aging, not just end-of-life aging, but the secret to all aging is learning to live in terms of what we can do instead of trying to live in terms of what we can't do. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories tonight. The stories are not prescriptive, they're simply descriptive. They're about 3 people I have known very well who faced the ends of their life and figured out how for them to keep what was most important to them alive as long as possible. So you're ready to go? Here we go. So I spent 25 years as a United Methodist pastor, and in 1972, the bishop sent me to a new appointment. I was serving a church in Lexington, North Carolina, and I was assigned to the Cherokee County Parish, that last little county there in the tail end of North Carolina, between Tennessee and Georgia. I was a poor young minister, and I couldn't afford to go up there and look around ahead of time. So the first time we ever saw where we were going to be living was when we drove into town. I was driving a 27-foot U-Haul truck hauling everything we owned in this whole world. My wife was driving a little car with our one little boy in it. 2 more were to come while we were there. And we drove into the town of Andrews, and we saw the parsonage where we were going to be living. It was built in 1959, and it was not a split-level house. No, it was a tri-level house. It kind of ran down a hillside. One little layer, another little layer, another little layer. And in 1959, it was built out of blonde brick with a weird yellow-green trim. And we looked at that house, and the first thing I thought was, in the back of that U-Haul truck, there was an 800-pound, inherited through the family, upright piano. And I knew that piano was going to have to live on the top level, and the driveway was all the way on the bottom level. Well, I decided the thing to do was turn the truck around, unload everything in the garage on the bottom level, turn the truck in so we wouldn't have to pay for an extra day, and then maybe somehow through the years, all those things unloaded in the basement would gradually just make their way upstairs. So that was in the process of happening when all of a sudden, here came the first curious neighbor to meet the new preacher. He was coming through the yard from the house behind us, about 6'4", broad shoulders, about 20 years old, with freckles on top of freckles and freckles behind the ones in front, waiting to step up into place if the ones in front didn't show up that day. And hair that was not red, but was purely carrot colored. I met Joe Wheeler. Well, Joe had finished his sophomore year at Western Carolina University. He was living at home and commuting back and forth. He never lived on campus. He drove 50 miles back and forth almost every day to finish his college degree there. And here he was, and I looked at him, and I started thinking about that piano. And then I thought, no, you're just meeting for the first time. No, don't bring that up. No. And then about that time, here came another one. It was matched. He was the same size as Joe, but he didn't have freckles and he had brown hair. It was Joe's little brother, Jack. Jack was just starting his freshman year in Chapel Hill at the University of North Carolina. And the more I talked with those two big guys, the more I just couldn't get that piano off of my mind. And finally I said, hey guys, I hate to bring this up when we just met, but see this piano? We'd gotten it down off the truck, off the lift. It needs to go out to the street, up to the sidewalk, and in the living room. Do you think you could help me get it up there? And Joe said, I'll go get Mama. And he disappeared. And in about 5 minutes, he came back across the yard with Mama Ruth, a lesson in genetic consistency. She looked at that piano and she said, the three of you'uns get that end and I'll get this end. And she spit a great big spit of snuff spit and grabbed her into the piano and picked it up, and we got our end. And about halfway up through there, we tried to put it down and rest. She said, don't stop now, boys. We've got it moving. And we carried that piano and we put it where it lived in the living room for the next 6 years. And that's how I met Mama Ruth and Joe and Jackie, who were to be our wonderful backdoor neighbors for the next 6 years. When you live close to somebody like that, you gradually learn their life story. And gradually, I met two other children. I met Maxine. She was the oldest, and she was an adult, married and moved away. And then I met Gwen. Gwen was also older. Gwen was hilarious. Gwen had a slight amount of oxygen deprivation at birth, and he could come out with absolutely the funniest things you have ever heard in this world. They were so dear, and they were just like family in no time. Well, as time went along, I began to hear their story. There was no husband in that family. But gradually I began to learn that Ruth's husband, the father of those 4 children, had been an alcoholic meat cutter at the grocery store in town. And one day when Jackie, the youngest, was 8 years old, Mr. Wheeler didn't come home from work. And Ruth went down to see what happened, and she told me later she already had an idea what she was going to find before she went. He had waited until everybody else went home from the store, and then instead of going home, he had committed suicide in the meat department, leaving her, a mother with 4 children. They had never owned a home. They had lived in rented space forever and ever. Raising 4 children, she had never worked. She had a full-time job doing that. And now the future faced her. One day I was out in the yard and I said, Ruth, I kind of know about your family now. She said, I know you do because everybody does. I said, I want to know something. See, what I learned later was she went to work, was trained to carve headboards at Baker Furniture Company. building pieces of furniture the likes of which she would never own. She built a house and paid for it. She sent 3 of those 4 children to college. She did it all by herself without any help from anybody. And so that one day I said, Ruth, I want to know how you did what you managed to do. And she spit. And then she looked at me and she said, did it all in one day. And I wanted to hear the story. She said, when I came back up from the store that day and realized what happened, I knew if we were going to survive as a family, we had to learn how to vote. And then she left me standing there while she walked back in the house. And she came back out in a few minutes, and she had a little piece of paper. It had been folded and folded and folded and folded, and you could see it looking kind of greasy, dirty around the edges, like it had been handled about 1,000 times. And she opened that paper and she held it out to me, and on that paper, in her hand, was written 4 pairs of words. It said, happy or sad, sick or well, rich or poor, live or die. She said every morning at the breakfast table, we got out this ballot, and I read through it, and we voted on how the day was going to be. And once you vote, you make the day turn out like that. Well, the boys had a little different story to tell me. They told me she raised them using a large Arm & Hammer soda box. You know the picture on that box of the arm with the hammer? She told them that was her arm on the soda box. And in the morning, she'd get the soda box out and she'd put it up on the dresser. And she'd say, remember, that's my arm. When you get home this afternoon, do your homework, fix supper, and clean up the house. Joe said, I tried to run from her once, and that was all. Well, we hadn't been there very long that summer when Joe came over one day, and he said, over at the John Campbell Folk School, only about 20 miles at the other end of the county from where we live, at the folk school, they have a community dance every Saturday night. Why don't we go over there Saturday, and Mama can come and keep the baby? At this time, we still just had one baby. Well, Mama Ruth decided she didn't want to miss the dance, so she took the baby with her, and we all went. And once we went to the folk school on Saturday night, that's where we went every Saturday night to the big community dance. It was an amazing thing to watch. It was 1972, and the dance caller would get up and say, everybody get a partner and make a big circle, which at that time meant men ask a woman to dance and get in a circle. And the young men would get up and knock each other down, running to fight for the woman they wanted to dance with. Joe would just sit there. And then after everybody had the partner they were going to ask, he would get up and walk across the floor and ask the person least likely to ever be asked if they would be his partner. And after he set that example, from then on, everybody danced every dance. And Joe was so big, he could swing partners off the floor who hadn't left the ground since childhood. Well, he graduated there at Western Carolina in social work, and he got a job with social services. He became a caseworker with the elderly. He was a perfect person for that job, but he couldn't keep the rules. He couldn't keep from giving his elderly clients his home phone number. And sometimes way in the night, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, I would hear, rrr, 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 rrr. He was starting up his little orange Ford Fiesta. And I would look out our bedroom window and see Joe heading down the road, knowing that one of his elderly clients was sick or in trouble or maybe drunk or depressed. He just couldn't do anything except work 24 hours a day. One day Joe came over to the house and he said, I've got an idea. You know, at the folk school, Jack Hall is a master wood carver who has carvings in the Smithsonian. He said, Jack Hall's going to teach a class in carving wooden animals. He said, I've always wanted to learn to do that. Let's go over there and take that class. And we went over and we signed up, and then we went to the first class. And Joe and I learned in one class session that we were so talented, we could already carve fingers. And we didn't go back again. We didn't even ask for our money back because we had learned what a real talent it was for the people who could truly do that. But after that little aborted beginning place, Joe began to make this huge collection of hand-carved wooden animals. They sold them in the shop at the folk school. And every month he'd save a little bit of money, and he'd go over and he'd buy a little pair of animals, a little pair of animals, a little pair of animals. And one day he came over and he said, I'm ready. I want you to help me. Help me come and build Noah's Ark. And we built our version. It was about this big, of a ship with a gangplank going up the side. It totally covered his mama's coffee table in the living room. And gradually all those little animals that he collected filled the ark, filled the table, and then gradually began to fill the whole living room. One day Joe saved my life. When we'd moved into that house, I'd noticed a beautiful fireplace in the living room. And I said to one of the neighbors, does that fireplace work? And they said, well, the people who lived here before used it all the time. And when the first cool day came, you know, back in those years in October, not like we are 80 degrees in November now, I built a fire in the house and all the smoke came out in the living room. Well, then I remembered there was a cap on the chimney and a weight on top to keep the swifts out, the chimney swifts out in the summertime. And I ran out the front door. There was an open brick trellis built up beside that door. It had a paracanthus bush growing on it. And I climbed the bush and the trellis on top of the house, threw the lid off, and the smoke came out. And then I couldn't get back down. And I went over and looked down where I'd climbed up, and I thought, you can't come up that way. There's no way to do that. And all afternoon I sat on top of the house and watched people go by and wave. And wave and wave. And finally Joe got home, and he came walking over there, and he said, what are you doing up there? And I said, shut up. Go get a ladder and get me down. There was no ladder. But Joe came back in a few minutes with his mother's 3-step stool from the kitchen. He had it over his head on top of his shoulders, and he got under the lowest corner of the house and said, slide off and I'll catch you. And we did it, and I got down. One day I was out in the yard, and Ruth came walking across through our shared garden, and she was crying and crying and crying and crying and crying. And I said, Ruth, what's wrong? She said, Joe's leaving me. He's leaving me. He and Chuck Van Gorder are going to move out and go be bachelors. I said, Ruth, where are they going? She said, right up there. You could actually see the house from her house. But because he had stayed home all the way through college and was still living at home with his first job, he had never been away from her, and she couldn't stand the thought. Well, a few days later, to keep her from feeling lonesome, Joe and Chuck bought her a little dog without asking her about it. I heard about the dog, and I said, Ruth, so you got a dog. What kind is it? She says, it's a damned yap-yap toenail dog. It goes clickety-clickety-click, 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 and it barks out twice for every time it breathes in once. And pretty soon the dog had joined Chuck and Joe. And Ruth didn't miss any of them after that. We had a great time for those 6 years. 2 other children were born. They totally adored Joe. He would come over in the yard and they would run out in the yard and say, let's play merry-go-round. Jonathan, the baby, he'd put on his shoulders, and Jonathan would get a double handful of orange hair. And then Doug would get one hand, Kelly would get the other hand. They'd start running, and he'd be spinning around and around, swinging them up in the air, up in the air, up in the air, till they all got so drunk they'd fall down on the ground with everybody saying, do it again, do it again, do it again. Well, one night at the end of a dance at the folk school, Joe gathered everybody together. He said, come here, everybody, I need to talk to you. This is the last night I'm going to see all of you. I'm moving to Atlanta next week. I've quit my job. It was the 1970s. Remember, back then, many things we didn't talk about. And we knew that Joe had been trying to find Joe. But nobody asked any questions. We wished him well and we told him goodbye, and my friend was gone. We had no contact information at all. He left us just like that. I'd see Ruth in the yard and I'd say, Ruth, how's Joe doing? She said, he's doing great. He's a banker. I said, really, a banker? She said, yes, he works at night. He opens people's Visa payments and punches a big machine. He's a banker. That's the way the mothers tell the story, isn't it? And pretty soon we moved away, and I began, no matter how much I promised myself I wouldn't, to gradually forget about the Wheelers. In 1988, I retired from the church and began to travel full-time as a storyteller. When Christmas came that year, opening Christmas cards, all of a sudden I opened a card, no return address, like lots of Christmas cards. And it was a Christmas card from Joe. It said, Dear Donald, I'm so glad to know that you're telling all your stories everywhere. Your friend always, Joe. And I knew even though I couldn't see him, he was still watching me. It was a year or two later. I'd been on a long trip. I'd been out to California, actually, and I'd gotten back home, and it was Thanksgiving time, and there was a big stack of mail. And as I went through that mail, opening it all up, all of a sudden, there was a square card, and in the return address corner, it said Wheeler with an Atlanta return address. Wow, I tore into it. And when I pulled out the card inside, it was a letter to me from Joe's little brother, Jackie. It simply said, Dear Donald, my brother Joe is dying. He has AIDS. He now has lesions in his brain, and he can no longer communicate with anyone. But he made a list of people to whom I was to write when he got to this stage, and your name is near the top of the list. And there was a phone number at the bottom. I immediately picked up the phone and called the number. I said, Jack, why didn't you call me while I could come see him? Jack said, oh, no. That was Joe's plan. Remember the time frame? He didn't want to force his friends to think they needed to come to see him and maybe say things they didn't really believe. Even in his dying, he took care of others. I said, well, how's your mom? He said, well, she's right here. I said, can I talk to her? And Mama Ruth got on the phone. And I kind of stupidly said something like, "Well, Ruth, it must be really bad. You're already there." And she said to me, "Don't you remember anything?" And I could hear her spit. She said, "We're a family who knows how to vote." As soon as we learned that Joe was sick, I took retirement from Baker Furniture. Jackie took a year's leave of absence from his job in California. Maxine was old enough to retire from teaching. You know, Gwen does pretty much what he wants to do anyway. And we all came and moved in with Joe so that every day we could vote for him to be alive as long as we could make it happen. And we said goodbye. It was only about a week later when Jackie called again to tell me Joe had died. And I thought, this time I've lost a friend for good. I thought. But remember all those little carved wooden animals Joe had collected? Well, Jackie ended up with them. And instead of keeping them, he had taken that same list of friends to whom he was to write on Joe's behalf, and he had divided up those animals. Something Joe had held, touched with his own fingerprints, breathed on. And he had sent them out to as many people as they could possibly reach, so we would all have something from Joe's life. And I opened a little box at the post office and pulled out of that box the little carved wooden animal I know Joe had picked out himself just for me. Carved standing on its front legs with its back feet in the air, a little carved wooden jackass. And in the bottom of the box, Joe's business card, showing me that when he died at age 44, he was a vice president of the Trust Company Bank. You know what I did with that little card? I turned it over and wrote 4 pairs of words on the back. I wrote happy or sad, rich or poor, sick or well, live or die. And every time I have one of those days, you know, when you just can't keep yourself going, I pull out the ballot and I listen to Ruth say, "You got to know how to vote." And I read those words and I'm amazed once again that we live in a world in which a person who is no longer alive has the power to give life to the rest of us. Thanks for meeting Joe. Over there at the folk school at that Saturday night dance, the musicians were Otto and Marguerite Wood. When I first met them, Otto was 75, Marguerite was 76. She whispered that to me. They were total, absolute characters. They were tiny little miniature people. Otto was totally bald-headed. He played the fiddle. He was so little, most people thought it was a viola. And Marguerite was so lightweight, her feet didn't quite hit the ground when she walked. She kind of floated through the air, you know, bouncing off the air with her little feet. And she played big chords on the piano to undergird Otto's melodies. They played for the dance Otto called dances. They were simply filled with life and precious. They told us they never had any children, and when they were about 40, they began to get life figured out. I said, "Otto, tell me about that." He said, "Well, I've noticed that people do one of 2 things in their lives. They either buy things or they do things. And if you buy things, then you got to take care of them, and that's worse than having children to start with." So they decided to spend their life doing things. And Otto sold his half of the family gas station to his brother. Marguerite quit her job at the cash register at Rosie's dime store, and they went on the road between Lake Michigan and Bradenton, Florida, playing music for people to dance by, hopefully for the rest of their lives. They would play along Lake Michigan at summer resorts in the summertime. Then they'd drive down to Florida, and they would play up and down the Gulf Coast through the wintertime. And then they'd go back and forth and back and forth. There were dozens of stories about that trip between Michigan and Florida. One when Otto got stopped for speeding in a place called Stark. And he used words talking to the policeman that Marguerite had never heard him use before. And the policeman, who was about a foot taller than Otto, patted Otto on the head and said, "Better cool down, little feller." And Otto used those words again. And they took him to meet the magistrate, who decided he needed to go to jail for an hour till he cooled down. And they put him in jail with the other overnight drunks. And I said, "Marguerite, what did you do?" She said, "I just sat out in the car and played music while he waited for his hour to be up." There was story after story after story. I remember going to see them one afternoon, and they weren't home, but they got back while I was there. And I said, "Where you been?" Marguerite says, "To the store. We go this time every day. Go after lunch when you're not hungry and buy your groceries for the next day." I said, "Why don't you just go once a week?" "Oh, no, at our age we might die and not get to eat all of it." Well, one year in the spring of the year, now they were not traveling back to Michigan in the summer. Now they were spending the summer at the folk school, playing for dance classes and for the community dance on Saturday. They got out to come into the dance hall on Saturday night, and Otto was holding his fiddle case under his arm, walking on two crutches. And everybody looked to Marguerite to say, "What's going on?" She never wasted words on anybody. She says, "Cancer, might as well call it what it is. Took those doctors in Florida a long time to figure it out." And we began to watch this little man who just bubbled over with life and joy and happiness try to learn how to slow down. He would come in on Saturday night, pull a chair up to the end of the piano where Marguerite was playing, get out his fiddle and sit there in the chair and play as well as he could for those 2 hours. But you know, as the summer went along, all of a sudden it seemed like Otto was having some kind of remission. He got a lot better. And I went over to visit one afternoon. I knocked on the front door. Marguerite says, "Otto's out in the back. Come on through. We'll go back and see him." And on a hot July afternoon, we went out on the back, and there was Otto on the patio on the south side of the house in the sun, stretched out on a chase lounge, wrapped up in blankets, shivering. And then I learned the whole story. He was saving his pain medicine. No, it's not at all what you think. He had this all figured out. He wouldn't take it on weekdays. And then on Saturday morning, he would get up and take a dose. A little while later, he would take another dose. A little while later, he would take another dose. Until by 8 o'clock on Saturday night, he would come marching in the dance hall without even bringing his crutches, stand there and play his fiddle like a wild man for 2 solid hours without stopping, and then collapse and start all over getting ready for the next week. He played like that until he played on a Saturday night before he died on Tuesday. After that last Saturday night, he said to Marguerite, he said, "Marge, I think it's time for us to go back to Florida and say goodbye to everybody." She said, "When, Otto?" He said, "In the morning." And the next day they drove back to Florida, got there on Monday, visited all their friends, and the next morning Otto was dead. She called me and I answered the phone. Marguerite never wasted words. I said, "Hello." She just said, "Otto's dead. But not many of our friends are here, so I'm not going to waste him." I thought, what? She said, "No, I'm going to save his ashes and bring them back up to the folk school. And in the summer, between dance week and music week, we'll have a party in the woods and we'll say goodbye to Otto." Now, Otto and Marguerite were Episcopalian, but she did not like their young, right out of seminary priest. She called him Episcopal with a capital P. So she told me I would be in charge of the service. And when Marguerite said it, you did it. She said, "You say something about Otto, not silly." Well, I'd been thinking about something. I said, "Marguerite, I've been thinking about something. I wanted to ask you about it." I used to call dances sometimes there on Saturdays, and Otto and Marguerite would play for it all the way through. I said, "You know, when I was calling dances, if somebody else was playing, the hardest thing was to keep the musicians quiet while you taught the dance. And then when you're ready to dance, you got to wait while that same bunch now tunes up." But with Otto, it never worked that way. He was always quiet, and as soon as it was time to dance, he was always ready to play. She said, "Oh, that's the way life is. Some people tune, some people play." And I thought, silly or not, that's what I'm going to say about Otto. And they came back in the summer, and we met in the woods, and we sang and we danced, and we told stories about a little man who would not give up playing his music. If Mama Ruth's ballot doesn't work on those bad days, and God isn't on call, I talk to Marguerite. And I say, "Marguerite, tell me again how it goes." Some people tune and some people play. And let me get up tomorrow and start the day playing my music. Thanks for meeting Otto. You know, I'm so good at tuning. Sometimes I can tune for a week without ever playing. All kinds of versions of music. We have them, don't we? Yep. Well, let me finish with one other very personal story. In the year 2010, my wife Merle and I were on a trip to Sweden with our two dear, dear friends, Putt and Nanny Brown from Connecticut. And one morning we got up to head over to the Vasa Museum, where this huge ship that rode over in the water and is now preserved 250 years later, the whole museum is built around that ship. And we got up that morning and Merle said, "One of my ankles hurts." Well, we've been walking a whole lot, and I said, "Which one?" And she said, "Well, actually, both of them." Well, we just thought we'd been walking too much, so we went on through that day. And the next morning we got up, and I said, "How are your ankles?" She said, "They still hurt, and today my knees hurt." Well, the next day her ankles, knees, and hips hurt. And by then I'd called our family physician, a college friend of mine in Chapel Hill, Glenn Withrow, our family physician. And I told him what was happening. And he said, "When are you flying back?" And I told him, he said, "When you get back in, come spend the night at our house and I'll have a plan in place for you." And it was only 3 or 4 days later, by then her shoulders hurt. And we landed and we went to Glenn and Naomi's house to spend the night. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, before the office ever opened, he had a plan for us to meet his favorite rheumatologist, Dr. Toohey, Dr. Ann Toohey. Well, Glenn already had an idea what he suspected, rheumatoid arthritis. But Dr. Toohey did all the blood work and all the tests and everything and came back and she said, there's one particular test that I've done, blood work, and if she gets a 1, she doesn't have rheumatoid arthritis. If she gets a 2, maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. If she gets a 3 or higher, it's definite. We went in to get the results of the blood work. Dr. Toohey looked at us and said, I've been in practice for 38 years. I've never seen anyone get an 82 on that blood test. By then, Merle was totally in bed, unable to do anything. Well, then the medication started, and it gradually began to help. A dear friend, a storyteller, dear friend of ours, Kevin Kling. Kevin Kling has no arm on one side and half an arm on the other side. He began to teach Merle how to do all kinds of things, like how to button her clothes and how to open a can to fix something to eat. And gradually, between the methotrexate and the folic acid and the other the biologics that were then being tried, this and that, and finally she got to where she said, I think I'm about 50% back to the person I was before. But if anyone saw her, they thought she was well, because she could put on a show like nobody's business. Well, a couple of years later, she began to lose things. First, losing mail, losing checks that came in the mail for people who were coming to our summer workshops. And then I would get home from a trip, and everything in the attic would have been brought from the attic down into the bedroom for no explainable reason. But she didn't want anybody to stay with her. She said, I can't entertain anybody all the time if somebody comes to stay with me. That was her perspective on the whole thing. And then I was on a trip, and Jason Daniels, our deputy, found me on the trip and called me and said, I've got to tell you, something's happened to Miss Merle. The sheriff from Dare County called and said, she took her Jeep, a little Jeep we used to haul, go to the beach and haul trash in, and ended up with that Jeep later on, right there. And said she got that Jeep on the ferry, and she went to Hatteras, and she was sitting in the parking lot of a restaurant, and then she went in the restaurant, and she was holding a menu for an hour, and every time they went to get what her order was, she told them she wasn't ready yet, and then they saw that she was holding the menu upside down, and the sheriff called me, and I went up and got her and brought her home, but something's not right. And we got home that time and went to the clinic, and our dear physician, Dr. Aaron Baker, diagnosed her beginnings of dementia. She pulled her driver's license right then on the spot, and we began chapter 2 of the adventure compounding rheumatoid arthritis with dementia. We talked about that. We talked about it with Dr. Baker, talked with Merle. How do you want things to go from here? What do you want to have happen? Do you want me to be home and to not travel? She says, no. I want to go with you. I want to go with you. I want to go with you until the wheels run off the road. And so what we did was we had a Sprinter van upfit with a little bathroom and a bed and a little kitchen. And by then her, not yet wheelchair, but later on wheelchair, but then she could go with me, and we could go everywhere to storytelling festivals where she could see friends here and there, as she insisted, I want to keep going till the wheels run off the road. And then the first stroke happened. The first stroke happened when I was not in the house. She was in the garage. And somehow she scooted herself on her bottom from the garage next door all the way back to the house. Spent about 3 days in the hospital, came back home, and I said, what do you want to change? How do you want to do things now? I don't want to do things any different. She was now going to be in a wheelchair because it was easier for me. Got it? Dementia is a strange thing. Her dementia was it wasn't like a piano that gradually stops working all at once. It was more like a piano where one key at a time goes totally out and the rest of them still keep working. The first key that went out was she could not add two numbers together. She could not add 2 and 3. That was simply gone. One of the next keys went out. She could not do anything that involved more than just 2 steps. I mean, 1 step and the next step. She couldn't choose a can of soup, open the can of soup, heat the can of soup. That was just gone. And gradually, one thing after another left. She became incontinent and never even knew it. It was like a year-old child who simply accepts that as the way life is without any embarrassment or any awareness of it whatsoever. But you know, strangely, the key on that piano that did not go out was her knowing who people were. And that's one that leaves so often. But she always knew who people were. And she could hold court and call people by name and ask about their children when she had not been able to bathe or dress herself getting ready for that event. The last thing I do every year is an event at a place called Farrington, halfway between Chapel Hill and Pittsburgh. Farrington is a community there. There's a wonderful bookstore. There's a country inn. There's a huge barn that's been repurposed from barn to wedding center. And every year, the last thing I do before Christmas is a 2-day food raising event for a summer food bank where I tell stories on Saturday and Sunday. Merle grew up in Chapel Hill, and that's where all her high school friends would come to see her before Christmas in December. And that year, as that December began to approach, another stroke came. And I said, sweetheart, we can't go to Farrington this year. We can't go. If you want me to go and see everybody, I'll go see everybody. We'll get somebody to come stay with you. Karen Lovejoy says she'll stay with you while we go up there. Nope, she said, I'm going. And there was no way around it. She was going. For the months before that, an interesting thing had happened. We'd gone to the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival in Utah, 22 years, every year of going there. And this year she said, this is my last time to come to this festival. And then we went to the National Festival in Jonesboro, and all the way there she kept saying, this is my last time to come to this festival. And it was with a big smile and with great cheer. I'm going to see everybody for the last time. I'm seeing all my friends for the last time. I'm going to get to see all of them. And then my sense was that when she was determined to go to that event at Farrington, she meant to see her high school friends for the last time. So I got her in the Sprinter, now along with her wheelchair. We got up there to Chapel Hill, had a horrible time, with bathing and dressing and getting things ready. Got her in the wheelchair, rolled her over, and as soon as she saw friends, she was on fire. She visited with everybody. She knew all their names. She knew about their children. The only thing I could get her to eat that whole weekend was Pepsi and saltine crackers. The next day we had the second show and she went back exactly the same way. And people who saw her did not know the kind of shape she was really in, because she could, her social skills were brilliantly beautiful. Well, we got home from that trip, and the next day, she didn't get up. That wasn't too unusual when we got home from a trip. Very often, she would stay in bed the whole next day and then begin to come out after that. But the next day, she also didn't get up, and I couldn't get her to eat anything. And I said, "Sweetheart, now, if you can't get up by this afternoon, I'll have to go get Dr. Baker to come down to the house." Well, she couldn't get up. And I went up to the clinic and I talked to Erin Baker, and we sat down and we talked, and she said, "What do you want to have happen from here?" And I said, "Well, I promised her after the other stroke that I would never put her in the hospital again. That was the promise she extracted from me. I will never go back to the hospital. I am happy to die at home." And Erin said, "Well, what I was getting ready to tell you was that she made me promise the same thing." So we're on the same page. Let's go down and take a look and see if we can figure out what's going on. And Dr. Erin came down to the house, and she checked Merle out. And we walked outside and talked, and she said, "There's been some kind of event. It may have been another stroke, but there's no way to tell unless we put her back in the hospital. But you know what both of us promised?" She said, "Elizabeth is only a block and a half away on her bicycle. She's a hospice nurse." And before that day was over, we had spent the time doing the paperwork, and Merle was at home in hospice care. That was December 21st. Our boys took turns coming for about 3 days each, mostly to help me. And gradually, as people would come by to visit her, I would say their name as they came in the door, but I don't think I needed to. She knew who they were. She said goodbye to everybody. I kept thinking, will she make it through the solstice? Will she make it through Christmas? Will she make it to New Year's? Will she make it to Epiphany? It was December 27th when, in the middle of the night, I woke up from where I was sleeping on the floor at the foot of the bed, and she had left. I thought there is no point at all in calling Elizabeth in the middle of the night. I'll call her when the sun comes up. And I got up on the bed with Merle, and we simply remembered things and visited for the rest of the night. In the morning, I called Elizabeth, and she came over and pronounced her. It was the coldest weather anybody on the island ever remembered. There was even snow on the beach. And the funeral home people weren't sure if they could get there. I thought, that's fine. She can stay till they get here. But they did finally come with only a driver and a van. And so our great privilege was that my son Kelly and I got to be the two to carry her out of our house. And then I wept. And then we planned a party, because that's what she wanted. Not a funeral, but a party. Now, I'm going to tell you something very strange, and all I can do is say to you that as far as I'm concerned, it happened. If somebody else told me something like this happened to them, I would go, "Ah." But all I can do is say, it's what happened to me, and I believe it. The next day, I was taking out a big bag of trash, and all of a sudden, something hit me right in the head, like boing, in a split second, but it took me about 30 seconds to play out what I'd heard. And my first thought was, so that's what out-of-body communication is like. It was her voice as clear as it could be in a split second. And in that split second, she said, "You're not going to believe this place." I'm having a great time. You better have all the fun you can till we see each other again so we have more stories to tell. And that was it. Well, since then, we've been carrying her ashes around because her desire was to leave a few of them at all the meaningful places we'd spent time forever and ever and ever. And my wife, Trish, now, whom many of you know, we got married then 2 years later. We still haven't finished hauling all those ashes around. Gives us something to do, doesn't it? So thank you for meeting Merle. 3 stories, not prescriptive stories, but simply descriptive stories about 3 different people who in their own way were determined to hang on to what gave them meaning as long as they possibly could. We all have our versions. The good thing is, when we think about it ahead of time, we may get to make it happen the way we want to, instead of by someone else's default. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this wonderful storytelling and hopefully conversations that will be very helpful for all of us. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Seth McCormick. I have the honor of being a chaplain at Crillian Roanoke Memorial Hospital. Before that, I served with Crillian Hospice for 5 years as their hospice chaplain. So it was a joy to serve those patients and families. I'm curious, as our group's getting together, getting ready, how many of you have been in the same predicament as Donald with trying to figure out how to move a piano? Yeah, sadly, that's a story we can all relate to. And I wonder if, we see that piano, it's a behemoth, we hate it, we don't want to move it. And so we avoid it, and we stay away from it, and it collects dust, and it becomes a trial. I wonder if talking about the end of life is much like a piano, where we avoid talking about the end of life, and we don't want to move it, we don't want to deal with it, we just want to pretend it's not there. But when we move that piano, when we have those conversations about the end of life, there's such a sense of relief, a sense of feeling like, good. We had that conversation. We moved that piano. And I hope tonight our panel discussion will help us all to move those pianos in our own lives, in our own families. So I want to introduce again, just briefly, our panel so that they can wave so you know who you are talking to, addressing tonight. And we have a couple of microphones available so that when you have a question, we can get you a microphone. First, Dr. Christy Stewart. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Miss Caroline Butt. Shauna Colwell. And Mr. Davis. Thank you. So we want to open it up for questions. And I want to encourage you to not be shy. Don't hold back. Please raise those hands nice and high. Lisa is happy to run and get you a microphone. While we are waiting for you to gather your courage to ask a question, I'll start with Dr. Stewart. Dr. Stewart, you and I both know, having worked in a hospital, how emergent situations can change end-of-life conversations, can impact end-of-life conversations. So I'm curious, how might an emergent situation play out differently if family members talked ahead of time about their end-of-life hopes before that emergency took place?
Okay, so emergencies by definition are moments of crisis, right? And in moments of crisis, thoughts are not clear and emotions run high. And the place that emergencies generally happen are places like an ICU or an emergency room. And things move fast. They move really fast. If you want a team of healthcare professionals to save your life, you've come to the right place. That is what that place was built for. And they don't stop and they don't ask questions. They just move because they have a job to do. And they have the job to do for over 100 patients at a time in the same place. And it can be very disarming and terrifying to be caught up as a family member watching someone that you love more than anything go through that. And you assume that everyone in that team is acting in the patient's best interest, which is all true. They just don't always know what the best interest is. And so speaking as a family member, times in that emergency room, times in that ICU, times when things are falling apart, moments of crisis are not times to have conversations, and they're not times to make decisions because no rational thought exists in that place outside of what the machine was designed to do, which is everything possible to keep a heart beating. And so being able to be the voice of calm and the voice of reason in that place and to take that moment of time out and that moment of pause is a hard thing to do if you don't have a plan. And so in my life as a palliative physician and in my previous life as a geriatrician, which I practiced in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for about 15 years before I came here to practice palliative medicine, I used to take families aside and I'm going to say, at some point, something bad's going to happen. And we have to decide how we want to act and how we don't want to act, because once those wheels start moving, it's very hard to get them to stop. And they need a voice of reason. And it's not whatever you choose to do is the right thing to do, but we need to talk about what that's going to be and what that's not going to be, what limits might be in place, what not. And it's going to be up to you to communicate that because the machine has a very hard time stopping. So that can be very empowering for patients and very empowering for their families. And in that moment of fear and terror and crisis, there's a plan. And everything feels a little bit better and a little bit smoother with a plan. And it's a gift to be able to give the people around you, including the healthcare professions, because the only thing they want to do is serve their patients to the best of their possibility. Whether that means doing full CPR and intubation and hooking them up to machines, or that means just taking a moment of pause to make sure their other needs are being met. So that's where the conversations come in really handy before the event happens, as compared to in the midst of the terror when rational thought tends to fall by the wayside.
Thank you, Dr. Stern. All right, any brave folks who have a question? I see one. Thank you. Angela.
For any of you, I'm just curious, why is it not required? Why is it not a part of everyone's medical record?
In the state of Virginia, it is voluntary to have an advance directive, a post, pulsed, or a durable DNR. It is voluntary. In other states, Maryland, for instance, if you go into a nursing home or a nursing facility, then you have to have one. Virginia chose to not make that mandatory. We want everybody to have the choice and to do exactly how they want everything done at their end of life. Advanced directives should be started at age 18 and on, if nothing else, to choose who you want to speak for you. It doesn't even have to be a family member. Then as you get further along in the progression of your disease process, if you have neurological, dementia, Alzheimer's, ALS, cancer, of course, other diseases such as COPD, diabetes, kidney failure, you can change and make what's called a post form, a physician's order for scope of treatment. There's some examples here. And recently, Virginia has adopted the PULSE. That's a national form. It's the same thing as the post form, but this is a national form, and we will be moving to that form. And that is so that any state you go and visit, that form is recognized. So I'm really proud of Virginia for adopting the national form. And a durable DNR, which you have to fill out with a physician. That is only for if you want to be a code or CPR or no CPR. That's the only thing the durable DNR does for you, but it's strictly voluntary. Does that answer your question okay?
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, sir.
So in my family, both on my in-laws' side and on my father, we lost my mother in 2020, death is not to be, is the unspoken. And so what's a good starting point for those who are very resistant to even the idea of, we're not going to talk about end-of-life planning, we're not going to talk about those kind of decisions. What's some of those, what's a good foot in the door for those who are extraordinarily resistant, the high emotion of whereas I'm like, hey, that's a companion, you know, but I can't get that over on the rest of my family. So what's a good starting point?
Generationally speaking, we see that a lot with our older folks. It's just not talked about, but a lot of times it's just a matter of being persistent and being consistent, but also being really sensitive to the fact that they are having a struggle with talking about those things. Sometimes for me, what works is just saying, you know, I need to know what you want because I don't want to do anything that you don't want. My mother was diagnosed a few years ago with early Alzheimer's and dementia, and we had to sit down and have this conversation with her. And she's very much of the mindset, you know, if you talk about it, then it's going to happen. Something will happen. So sitting down with her and saying, hey, we just need to know what you want us to do because we don't want to do something that you're not going to be happy with. We want to make sure that you get to have your life lived the way you want it. And it takes time. It really does take time. They're not necessarily going to change their mind right away, and sometimes you may not be successful, but just a little bit at a time, trying to ease that into conversations.
They are hard. They're a really hard conversation to have. So I do this for a living. I have hard conversations with strangers for a living. I don't know how to have small talk with people. I only know how to delve into your deepest. Yeah. So you want to talk about the weather? I have no idea what to do with that. You want to talk about what matters most? There I am. So what I usually phrase these conversations with patients who are reluctant to have them with me. This isn't about dying. That's not what this is about. This is about living. Okay? We don't get the choice in how we die. I wish we did, but we don't. We get the choice in how we live. So that sometimes is a reframe of the conversation. How do you want to live? And the two questions that I ask my patients, that's not true. I have thousands of patient questions, but and scripts I follow and all kinds of tools. Two questions. What is most important? What makes your life yours? What are the things that you can't imagine living without? And two, how much are you willing to go through for a little more time? I really like that question. How much are you willing to go through for a little more time? Are you willing to go into a hospital? Are you willing to be hooked up to machines? Are you willing to go to a nursing home? Are you willing to have major surgery? How much are you willing to go through for that little bit more time? And I think that sometimes is a nice place to start the conversation. When patients go, I don't want to talk about death. I say, that's not what we're going to talk about. Let's talk about life. Let's talk about how we want to live. Let's talk about what's important in our life and how we can honor and respect that. So I find that to be a meaningful way to usually break through some of the emotional barriers people put up around having these conversations. But I feel it. I do feel it.
I can tell you a little trick for the younger folks. And then when you bring it to like a family dinner or something, had a nurse whose father-in-law was struggling really hard. They didn't know how to approach it. He would not talk about it. So she brought a stack of advance directives to a family dinner one night, laid them out on the table, and she said, we're all going to fill one of these out. And it doesn't matter how old you are, as long as you're 18, we're all going to fill them out. Because we all need to know what our wishes might be. And it broke the ice, and everybody talking about it. Finally, the father-in-law did actually fill one out, and he ended up filling out a post form for her. So sometimes just bringing it in and having everybody involved in the conversation, because they're going to have to fill one out too, is a way to go. Nice family dinner.
Yes, for those of you looking for ways to break the awkward silence at Thanksgiving, that would do it.
And you don't have to talk about politics.
Yeah. You avoid religion, you avoid politics, just go right to death. I mean living. Sorry, Dr. Stewart. Next question.
Hey there. I am curious about everyone's thoughts about the role of end-of-life doulas with the whole kind of circle of care that comes at the end of life, and also just your thoughts on how that can kind of, incorporate a little bit more into the options that are there.
I love this concept of an end-of-life doula. And there are people in the audience that I am looking at that I know are far more qualified to talk about this than I am. So feel free to jump in. The idea is that this can be a hard emotional place for the person going through it and a hard emotional place for the people around them. And just like childbirth, the role of a doula is to try to ease the emotional and physical impacts of a very stressful, intense situation. Having someone to guide through at end of life in those scary moments, just be present and calm and explain what's happening and normalize it and rationalize it. And that's what my doula did for me in childbirth. As I was going crazy and saying things that have never come out of my mouth since, and hopefully won't. It's that voice of calm and that voice of rationale and that voice of reason and that person who knows what this process looks like. And I think that's an awesome, awesome thing. It's a hard place to hold, that vigil, that constant presence with nothing to do, no way to act except to just be and be present. And having company and having someone to share that space, I think, can be exceptionally valuable. I wish it was something that more people could do. So it's a rare gift to be able to hold that space. We are seeing it a little bit here and there in the hospital, but I'm not going to say that it is a normal part of anything yet, although I wish it were.
I think in the hospital setting, oftentimes the chaplains or spiritual care coordinators play that role of a doula. Having been one for many, many years and still am, our role as chaplains was to be present with patients and their families in the midst of the dying process or the living process. And the gift to have someone who was calm, who could, as I would often say, open up the system a little bit, because oftentimes it's very scary and uncertain, and to have someone who was willing to be present with whatever was happening within that room or beyond that room was so helpful. And I think doulas and spiritual leaders who are able to be in those places is a gift to our families and to those who are in the process of living and dying. Other questions?
Someone's got to throw a question to Mr. Davis here. All right.
Thank you, all of you, but especially Donald for coming here and sharing his stories. They make these conversations so much easier because it is through stories that we can get people to open up. I have yet figured out how to get my in-laws to open up to this conversation. It seems, as you mentioned earlier, that it is in that moment of crisis that everybody wants to talk about it, but it's absolutely the last place to do it. And then when things normalize, nobody's comfortable having that conversation. And when you're dealing with, in this case, the patriarch of the family, they rule the roost, as it were, and you're not, family members just don't seem to have the ability to break through. I like the idea of bringing out the end of life conversations at Thanksgiving dinner. That isn't going to work in this family. I know that. It's more than just about your comment. But it's about living. How do you want to live, not how do you want to die? It's a great conversation starter. But the elephant in that room also is, how do you pay for that? How as a son-in-law, I can see where we're going, but I don't see how it's going to happen without extreme duress, not just to the patriarch, but the matriarch as well. how do we move that conversation along, not just in how do you want to live, but what resources are out there to help make that happen? It's just, I don't know. And I know I was going to ask a question of Donald, but my wife and I, of course, have heard Donald many, many, many times, and some of these stories are just, I wish Donald could come to our house and have that conversation with my father-in-law. That would, he certainly, yes, what are you doing after the thing tonight? But it seems that the stories are truly the way to get into some people's mindset.
Well, we're looking at two different things. We're looking at I'll think about it versus I'll feel it. And so, often from the professional side of things, we're saying people ought to think about these end-of-life issues. But when it comes to someone's end of their own life, it's not about thinking about it, it's about feeling. It's about emotion. And so that's one of the things that story does. Story moves us from I'll think about it to I'll feel it. And the three stories I told you, the whole stories are about twice as long as the versions you got tonight. And so, it's important to me in the story about Joe that you laugh with Joe and you get to meet him until you're feeling a relationship with that family before we turn the corner. We don't go straight into I'll think about it. The story is really important as a model, as a feeling model. I know for Merle, the story of Otto and Marguerite was very important to her in the decline of her life. And over and over again, she would say, "Some people tune, some people play." When she got down about things, to say, "I'm going to play. I'm not going to just tune. I'm going to play." So if you have stories that your family knows about people who have done this well, people who have structured the end of their life well, then those stories can be repeated around the table. Remember so-and-so. Remember what they did. I hope I can do that well, in my own way. So stories are real helpful and real important that way, because they give us a chance to feel, not just think about it. We're not going to make a decision thinking about it if we're not feeling that we're in the right place.
I will also say that my husband underwent brain surgery about 5 years ago. It ended up being a benign cyst, but we didn't know it at the time. We thought it was cancer. So we were blessed. And my husband looks at me, the healthcare professional, as he's about to undergo the surgery and says, "We should have the talk."
Uh-huh.
And I looked at him and I went, "No, no, I don't want to do this with you." Being able to open up about the things that are important to you in your life and at your end of life sometimes is a really hard thing to do, because it means hurting and it means leaving potentially. And that's a really hard thing to talk about. So that's why healthcare professionals exist. Sometimes we are the safer places to explore the scariest of concepts, which includes grief and leaving the people you love most. And we can structure the conversation and we can make it feel normal, and we can because we do it. It's what we do. And I don't want to say it removes some of the emotion, but it removes some of the emotion, and that's sometimes a really healthy way to look at it. So what I'll say is, if you're having a hard time engaging your loved ones, don't be afraid to reach out to healthcare professionals, people in this room or otherwise, because we can help and we can be objective and we can be compassionate, and they can do it honestly and openly without fear of saying something that may hurt the people that they love most around them. So that sometimes is another aspect and avenue. So, and then one of the questions I asked as I'm finalizing it, we're going to need to share this one way or the other. And then we talk about how we can safely do that, whether it's bringing them in and having me share it, whether it's putting it down on a piece of paper, whether it's some other form of documentation, or how to structure that conversation. So I'm just going to say it doesn't all have to be on the people you love the most, and sometimes it's safest not for it to be on the people you love the most. So
That's what I was going to say. In Carillion, I work for Carillion, of course. Family and Community Medicine is who I work for, and we have trained over 300 facilitators. We call them advanced care planning facilitators, and 2 of the instructors are here tonight, and 3. Lydia as one as well, Wendy and Nicole and Lydia over there. And we have those conversations. If you have a primary care provider in Carillion, all you have to do is ask to have a care coordinator come over and talk with you and your family about that. And we don't jump right in and say, okay, ready to fill out the form. What do you want? No. We take very intensive classes to make sure the people that we train as certified facilitators take their time, flush it out, see what's going on. So it's not on you guys. It's on the facilitator to direct the conversation. The conversation is what is important. It is not the form that you fill out. It is the conversation, getting that started. That's the hardest part. It's the hardest part for every one of us. We could have done it 100 million times. It is still hard to have that initial conversation. But that's what we're trained to do, all of us. And we're glad to help anyone that needs it. Again, if you're in Carillion, just ask your PCP's office to schedule an appointment with a care coordinator, social work, or home health hospice, of course.
Outpatient palliative care clinic.
Yes, exactly. And we're here to help you have that conversation with your families. And then it's on us to make it work efficiently. And so the family and the patient understand what's going on, and we give them a chance. And sometimes they want to have a conversation just with us. And then what they do is, okay, I'm ready for my family to come in, and will you tell them? Just exactly like Dr. Stewart said. There are a lot of ways we can do this. But I love doing it in primary care because it's relaxed atmosphere. It is not crisis. We can take our time. We can have 25 conversations if you want 25 conversations. It is relaxed. We can ask medical questions to your PCP. There is that bond that your PCP and the patient create, and then we just take it from there, and we help them decide what they want or don't want, and do it in a way that's not intrusive to that person. It's thoughtful, it's laid out, it's at your speed. When we start a class, what I always tell them, this is not about us. This is the one time in your medical career that it is not about you. It is not about your agenda. It's about that patient. It's about that patient's agenda. We're a guide by their side. We are not here to tell you what to do. So we have those thoughtful conversations, and it's easier for us to do them and be a third party. Does that make sense to everybody? And we're really glad to help.
Thank you, Caroline. We are at our time. I see one person really disappointed with me right now. We have time for one more question.
This is from my teacher, Stephen Jenkinson, and something that he discovered in his time in palliative care was that many people who were dying were more afraid of being forgotten than the pain that they might experience. And so I wonder how many of us remember those who have died, who are part of our families, and do we bring them in at Thanksgiving time, or is it just the ones who are at the table? So if you're having this talk about death, I think it's important that we remember the ones that died before us, so that the people that we're discussing death with aren't afraid of being forgotten. So.
From the story end of things, the sub-Saharan Africa concept of the living dead, where as long as there's someone still alive telling stories about you, you're not all the way dead. You're only dead when no one else remembers you. and to work on what's your list of people you can keep alive by telling about them. And do that in front of the family. Keep it going. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right, I'm going to invite Lisa Sprinkle up to close us. Thank you all for your great questions this evening.
Well, we said it would be a night of fellowship, and I feel like we have accomplished that. Thank you, Mr. Davis, for joining us this evening. Thank you for the stories of Jack and Otto and Merle. Thank you for sharing that part of the life that lives on. That's the legacy of all of these individuals. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you all, our panelists. Let me extend our gratitude to our panelists for being with us this evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you on our website, pcprv.org. Thank you, and have a blessed and safe evening.